So I'd like to welcome Megan Kierstead to the podcast. Welcome, Megan.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, whatever time it is.
Everyone is listening globally, so it's either good morning or afternoon or evening. So whoever's
Love it.
listening, everyone
Right.
gets reached there. My wife actually shared with me an episode. I totally forget who it was you were speaking with. It was a couple months ago, and what really resonated for me about it was a lot of the work that I do somatic therapy. So it's really about reconnecting the parts of yourself instead of comparing, where you're supposed to be, just where are you right now in this moment? How do you connect and relate to those parts? And I loved how you were talking about neurodivergence with so much love. And I thought it'd be really nice to kind of have your input here and your experiences to share about how we can actually celebrate our neurodivergence. The neurodivergence isn't the problem. It's the structure of normalcy that we're trying to fit into that is actually the issue.
100%. Yes. Essentially, we live in a society that wasn't built by or for us. So, unsurprisingly, like anyone who exists in a world that wasn't built for them, there's some friction. And we make that mean a lot about us, but it doesn't mean anything about us. It just means that the world, isn't always friendly or kind to people who think or act differently. I mean, we know this from history in a lot of different ways. So, in my mind, neurodivergence is just another way of sort of separating people from each other and for not like celebrating the complete diversity of the human experience.
Well, I would love to hear a bit about how you navigated this. Like, what was your story of diagnosis, of experience? Tell us a bit about that.
So, I was diagnosed actually later in life, not like super late. It's been a while. It's been over a decade now, which is actually weird to say out loud. But I was diagnosed with ADHD after college, and it explained so much. It explains so much of my life, and I actually work with a lot of people who have a similar experience. They don't learn until later on why the world feels so hard, especially if they have a story similar to mine, which is, being a very motivated, highly intelligent human for a good chunk of my life up to a certain point, things were really easy. Like very, very easy. And particularly if you're a girl with ADHD, the symptoms don't manifest in the same ways typically as they do in younger boys. So a lot of particularly highly intelligent women do not get diagnosed until later in life. And so they have this experience usually starting around high school, which is where it sort of happened for me, where things just become unmanageable because a lot of what you're expected to do requires executive function, which is the sort of planning and organizational part of your brain. So for me, it was homework. Doing homework was such a source of anxiety and shame and nightmares. And I was otherwise an incredibly good student. I still actually went to a very fancy college, got in by the skin of my teeth after being waitlisted at every school I applied to, which don't think that didn't give me a complex. And essentially doing something where I didn't have an internal motivation to do it, and I had no structures around it. I didn't have parents looking over my shoulder to tell me to do it. I would literally lie awake in bed at night thinking about the English paper that I hadn't written and hadn't turned in, and like not sleeping. And this continued for many years and even into college. And I did well in college because I was able to explore more of what interested me. But at some point, I actually started seeing a psychologist. I hadn't even considered that I had ADHD. Wasn't even a thing because, like many people, I associated with, people running around and being very disorganized and also being like a lower achiever, which all are lies. Um, um, so at some point, the psychologist looked at me and was like, "You definitely have ADHD." Then we did all the diagnosis and formally got it diagnosed and all that jazz. So since then, a lot of this has been a journey of really learning about what it means to have a brain that works differently, what it means to have a nervous system that works differently. Because the thing to realize about ADHD and other neurodivergent labels is that they are describing biological, physiological differences. There's nothing wrong with you beyond the way that like some people have brown hair and some people have blonde hair. That's essentially like we're describing the diversity of human stuff of if we got into the genetics, we'd be looking at the genetics, but essentially human traits vary, and ADHD is one of them. So I spent probably, I mean, it's over a decade at this point, really diving in and learning much more about myself and like what things it's going to affect, what things it doesn't, and also what things is it going to make me really strong in. So I actually worked in tech for over a decade, and you know, got to the point where I had a career reckoning and decided that, you know what, I want to help people like me, especially because I see how this is in fact a gift if you let it be a gift, and how also people don't understand how society is set up such that we're going to experience friction. It just is. So there's a lot of self-blame and shame around having ADHD or any sort of other thing that makes you different.
I love all that. And I kind of want to pause and let people just sink into the idea of it being a gift, because I was diagnosed with ADHD when I was 9. And I remember growing up with it. It was such a stigma. It was like I was looked at as having a disability. There was something wrong with me. I'll never do this, this, this. And I've also come to find it as a gift. And what was so beautiful about your interview that I was listening to was you were actually, I forgot I had ADHD, first of all. Like, I just forgot because I started living differently and I felt totally like myself. I felt natural. And then when I heard your interview, I realized, oh yeah, I forgot. When I'm not living like this, I felt really dysfunctional for many, many years. And so I kind of want to go into the nuance a bit of like the biology, the experience of ADHD. How did it manifest in your body? How does it feel?
Sure. I would say the most salient thing is how much is always going on in my head. It feels when I'm in a sort of, I would call less managed state, where I'm sort of not really getting in tune with things. It feels like there are literally like bees in my brain, like that just buzzing all around, and there's nothing you can do to like make them not exist. You can't fly swat inside your head, as it were. So it's this constant like buzzing and going, and you can't turn that off. But the thing is, when you sort of understand what's going on and understand why that is happening, you're able to be like, okay, it's because I actually take in more information from the world, which is, we know is true. And there's more things making connections in my brain. Okay, cool. So my job is to both set up my environment and sort of set up what I'm doing, like to be things that allow those connections to thrive, and also to get rid of all the extraneous information as much as possible. So a lot of the stuff that I like practical techniques I teach people around externalization. So essentially getting things out of your brain and storing them or putting them somewhere else, whether that's in technology, you know, pen and paper. Sometimes it's actually externalizing it to someone else's brain. So there's that. And then there's, you know, when I feel like I'm in friction with the world, it's very tight and very anxious and it's hard. It's like, you know, you want to do something, you know, you need to do something. And no matter what you do, it's almost impossible to move yourself in that direction. It's like a feeling of sort of anxious inertia. Whereas when you're sort of leaning into your gifts, when you're really accepting and doing things that are interesting to you, it's a pull. And it's not a bad pull. It's an exciting, wonderful pull that helps you understand like where you're meant to be. I like almost literally feel a pull in my body towards things. But it took a while to get in tune with that, because there's a lot of other stuff that people sort of teach us that we're supposed to be doing that just get in the way of getting in touch with that.
I love that. You know, the externalizing was a huge asset that I discovered, like just naturally, like you did, because I would, same thing, I would lay down still at night, the endless racing. And what's interesting is there's like this relationship now to it of, instead of what's wrong with me, I need to push that away. It's like, oh, that's how my brain works. And there's such a calm in me when it's happening. It doesn't like hype me up like it used to. But the externalizing was huge because I learned when I would make a list, the moment the list would exist out of my brain and on a paper, there would be this instant regulation of my body. And then I would give myself the time to go through it and I would just do things. And if I didn't have that list, I literally couldn't do anything. It wouldn't work.
Yeah, and so the thing to understand about this is ADHD affects our working memory, which is sort of like the workspace of our brain. So to do anything, we need to be able to put things in working memory, and we have a limited number of slots. And if you have ADHD, you have fewer slots than average, which means essentially if your brain is full of all this stuff, all your slots are taken up. So you can't do any problem solving. You can't actually literally do stuff. So you have to like clean out that working memory, put it somewhere else, whether it's, you know, sort of really reminding yourself of the things that don't matter and sort of doing thought work, or like actually externalizing them. But one of the like most powerful techniques I teach people is something I call like brain exorcism. It's exactly what you described. Don't even need to put it in a to-do list, but literally just like get stuff out of your brain for like 5 minutes. And if you do that regularly, your brain just becomes cleaner almost. And it doesn't mean you don't have a lot of stuff going on, but it's much less cluttered. And I feel like in my brain, it's less cluttered. So particularly for people who often feel overwhelmed, one of the things I'll recommend they do is like, just do that a few times a day. And at some point it'll start being like, oh, I don't actually have much to write down. And you don't even have to do anything with that list, like, or that writing. You can literally throw it in the trash, you can burn it, do whatever you want with it. But just the act of getting it out gets you access to your brain.
Well, you speak to this process that I call often like witnessing parts of ourselves, right? And in the trauma therapy work, this transformation happens when there's a stored trauma part of us, let's say, a traumatized part of us, let's say, stored in the chest. And so someone that experiences a lot of anxiety in the chest, that's that part speaking, essentially. It's almost like another being, if you will. So when you said exorcism, I'm right there with you. Because then when you're tuning in somatically and you're feeling that sensation, you're witnessing it. And in that witnessing, there's this slight separation from identifying with it. And it's extremely clarifying. There's all this space created just from doing that. So when you say to put that out of the mind, out of the brain, you're literally creating space in your brain just from witnessing what's in there versus it kind of, you know, rattling against you all day. Is that your experience?
Exactly. I love that. Yes, 100%.
Yeah.
And that reminds me that you literally feel shifts in your body when you're able to get stuff out of the sort of parts of your brain. Of course, the mind body separation is a myth, and like we are all a sack of meat, and as it were, and the brain is included in there. So unsurprisingly, a lot of the stuff that's happening, you know, in our actual, you know, nervous system in our brain, if you manage that, it affects so much else in your body, which I know is much of your work. So I think that's one of the most powerful things, particularly for people with ADHD. We spend a lot of times in our head. So getting things out of our head is really important, but also getting back into our bodies, super important. There's tons of research about how movement is just crucial. If you have ADHD, you need to move in some way and get reconnected with your body. Like one of the like hacks that people use is like literally like going for a walk or going for a run before something like a test, and they like your test scores actually shoot up, which is just fascinating to think about.
I'm really glad you said that because I wanted to talk about the biology, the biological response, right, for someone with the ADHD brain. Having one, I can attest to this. And doing the somatic trauma therapy work, really what you're talking about right there is the adrenals. And when the brain is cluttered with information, and for someone with ADHD, information is really high sensation, you know, for us in a lot of ways. That like even the word sensation, the information creates a biology of charge, right? And that's an adrenalized state, which can actually throw you into panic attack, trauma response, all these things based on your history. So when you say about running or doing yoga or stretching or moving, you're literally helping to metabolize some of that adrenaline that's just building from your thoughts. So I think it's important to keep reminding people that neurodivergence isn't just like you think differently. It's like your body is different. We have to do this
Yeah,
body-based.
I call it I borrowed this phrase, but I love calling ADHD an interest-based nervous system, which I think is a really powerful way of thinking about it. And it also takes away a lot of the like, this is a disorder, there is something wrong with you. But it's also recognizing that it's not just in your brain. It is in fact anything related to your nervous system, because what we're talking about here, at the very least, from what we understand, is very significant differences in neurotransmitters. That's
Yes.
where a lot of this originates, from what we can tell. We also have some of the sizes and shapes of some of the structures in our brain are a little bit different too. But at the end of the day, it comes down to chemicals. It's literally chemicals in your brain. And guess what? Chemicals in your brain affect everything. Because
Everything. The way you digest,
unsurprisingly,
everything.
I believe it's I always mess this up, but the precursor, no, the molecule that comes in a chain after dopamine, which is one of the, deficient chemicals or lower level chemicals in ADHD, is norepinephrine, which is of course essentially an activating neurotransmitter. So essentially the sort of activation deactivation circuits are a little bit different.
That's
To say the least.
exactly right. And I think that's the important piece here, because we're talking about the brain, which is one piece of the nervous system, but it's connected to branches that touch every organ and part of our square inch of our body, essentially from the inside. So the whole body's responding to that activation. And, I think another thing I loved about the interview was interest-based. Like, I would love to dive into that for those listening here, what that means with ADHD. Tell us about that.
Sure. So we were just talking about the neurotransmitters. So let's start there. On average, and they aren't sure always where it starts, but you have less dopamine in your brain if you have ADHD. Just the thing. And dopamine is the neurotransmitter of movement. Not physical movement, though, yes, to that, but in the way that motivation is a movement, because it's a movement towards something. So that's how I think about it, rather than like the pleasure chemical or something. It's the neurotransmitter that gets you to move and do. So we have lower levels of this, and you can imagine that any particular task sort of like has an activation energy. And if you start out lower, that means you need more dopamine to like exceed that threshold. So that means for you to exceed that threshold, you need to produce more dopamine, which means you need to be doing things that are more interesting, that are more urgent, that essentially tell your brain there's something like significant going on. Whereas, that activation sort of differential is smaller for other people. So they don't need as much dopamine. They can just get the dopamine from, say, thinking, oh, like my boss thinks this is important. You can think that as much as you want with an ADHD brain and be like, I'm not moving. I don't have the motivation to do it. So instead, you need to figure out, okay, how do I make this interesting? How do I make this challenging? Because that releases more dopamine and will actually get you moving. That's sort of roughly the like neurochemistry of why it works that way. And it's also why one of the most crucial things for people with ADHD is that they spend the majority of their time doing things that they're actually interested in and challenged by. I think I saw a quote from Ned Hallowell, who's a like very prominent ADHD researcher, and he essentially said, it's not optional for people with ADHD to have a job that they really love. You have to have that, or else over time you're going to burn yourself out, because you're essentially tapping into your willpower on a day-to-day basis, and it's exhaustible.
So that was one of the things that was really validating, when I heard your interview, because we everyone who knows me has joked with me for my whole life how I quit all my jobs after 3 months. So I get the job, I'm super interested in it, it's so new, I'm so curious, and then once I hit that end point of like I figured it out, I have to go to the next job. So I probably had like 14 to 20 jobs in maybe 3 years, and it just kept happening like that until I developed my own private practice, because then I was endlessly interested in humans, so it never gets old, so this feels stable. But I 100% relate to that. If I'm not interested, I can't even fake it. I will start dissociating. And so
yeah,
is
that is
that how
a
you
really
experience?
common story. Like, I remember almost like crying on a day-to-day basis, like trying to convince myself to go into work.
Oh
And I
yeah.
had a very like prestigious, interesting job at a startup, and was paid very well, all this kind of stuff, but it was such a fight because I wasn't determining fully what I was doing. I wasn't working on stuff that necessarily I thought was the most important or most interesting. So my brain was like, nope, we really don't want to do this. And it wasn't until, I really embraced being an entrepreneur that, yeah, now it's not a problem at all. Now I'm like, oh my God, I love working. Let's get up and do things.
Absolutely.
And it's such a difference. Like, until you experience it, especially if you just over and over again have had that like very disheartening, why doesn't anything work? What's wrong with me? Why do I need to keep switching jobs? Why do I not stick with things? Finding the thing or things that actually work, it's like you are you for the first time. And it is so empowering and freeing in such a deep way, because you get energy everywhere in your life, because all the energy you were spending white knuckling, like showing up to something that didn't interest you, then can be redirected to doing all the other things that we want to do as humans. So it's pretty magical once you sort of get to that place, and if you're able to get to that place.
That's the part that interests me about the gift, because and I'll also actually say another piece first. When you were talking, I always have this personal philosophy, maybe it's actually out there in the world, that all these things we call conditions or disabilities are just like heightened forms of what everyone experiences, but they're not all structured that way to experience it. So when you're talking about interest-based, and like the freedom of curiosity and joy in what you're doing, to me that's like such a human experience. The difference between my brain, your brain, and someone, let's say, who's neurotypical, I guess that's the term, is that they're not as sensitive like somatically to that experience. Is that your take as well?
Yeah, essentially, because you don't need those larger hits of dopamine. Like you can, because your brain just naturally has more, you don't need as much, which means essentially you weren't as sensitive to experiences not being something that like really activates you. Because essentially what we're talking about is nervous system activation. You need things that activate you in a significant way to sort of have motivation with ADHD. So essentially they are less sensitive to not being interested or not being rewarded in that way. Doesn't mean, of course, that doesn't matter. I hope everyone can follow their curiosity and do things they love and interest them, but it is not optional if you have ADHD. It's just not optional. You can fight it, and trust me, people fight it for a very long time, and many of my clients fight it. But once you let go of that and actually start following the threads of your curiosity, it really changes everything.
And I appreciate that you say it's not optional, because I kept highlighting that in my mind when you were saying that earlier. Because again, it's not that no one else doesn't like going to work, but for us, like we'll be immobilized, crying, feeling like horribly depressed, where someone can actually get through that. I don't have capacity to get through that. Like I lack that capacity. And so, you know what I mean? So it's not an option. It like physically can happen.
Yeah. And it is interesting because, of course, our bodies are capable of pushing us through things sometimes, which is why we do, get to that point. But inevitably, if you start, it is physical. You get that feeling of burnout of like, I can't do this anymore. That means you've essentially tapped into your reserves and you don't have any anymore. And sometimes it takes a really long time to actually build those reserves up again too, because they're very precious. And it's a stress response that you don't want to be having all the time. So getting to a place where you aren't ever tapping into your reserves so you can have them for actually like very stressful situations is really important, because that's the other thing. If you've tapped out your reserves, you aren't going to have the capacity to be resilient in anything that sort of comes your way, which is certainly something I experienced. So it's not just the experience of like, hating your job. It ends up percolating to literally everywhere in your life, because it reduces your emotional and physical resilience.
And I think it's so important. So happy people are hearing us talk about this, because there's so much misdiagnosed depression and anxiety disorder. Obviously, those are the expressions, but that's not the person's state. That's like a healthy response to this exact expression we're talking about of being neurodivergent. So you'd think like I have social anxiety, or I'm self-sabotaging, or I have depression, or I have, general anxiety, when really those are all expressions from I'm just not living in my nature because I didn't know I was allowed to. I was told there
Yeah.
was something wrong with me, right? When I was diagnosed back in the early 90s, they actually made me a prescription for Haldol, which is like an antipsychotic. And,
Yeah.
and that's how stigmatized, ADHD was, in at least Southern Pennsylvania, at the time. It was really looked at as like a clinical, psychological psychosis. And so they wanted to put me on this drug that was literally going to like zone me out. And lucky enough, my mother was a nurse, so she knew about medicine. She's like, "You are not going on that. We're gonna like, figure this out together." But what really helped me, and I want to know about you, I would say the three things that really changed my life were the externalizing what was in the mind, so putting it on paper, whether it's a list or just journaling or writing and burning it, whatever. Minimalism, like having less physical stuff. My brain is so overwhelmed when there's like any kind of like clutter or excess to look at. And nutrition, which I would also put herbalism in there. Those three things completely changed the way I navigate this world with ADHD. I'm curious what else that you haven't shared worked for you.
Totally agree on the environmental thing. And different people, it manifests in different ways, but that's one of the things that I don't see talked about that much, which is surprising because one of the things we know is that you actually take in more information. There's some interesting research about how we think actually back in the day, when we were hunter-gatherers, ADHD was actually a positive adaptation because we saw more of what's going on. Because you imagine if your attention's bouncing around and you're hearing and seeing and making connections, really good for like noticing something to eat or noticing that you're about to be eaten by a lion. Like that kind of stuff is really useful. So we actually take in more information, which means your physical environment and what information your brain is taking in on a regular basis is incredibly important to sort of like that space taking up. So in some cases, it's not minimal. Minimalism, though, I think that is often very powerful for people. It's as much as like really having a space that has a place for everything and where there is actually a minimal amount of change. Because what happens is that we notice changes in our environment. So like if you're home and everything stays the same and nothing's out of place, then your brain's like, oh, I can ignore all this. There's no danger here. You're essentially constantly sensing for change because change means potentially risk. So creating an environment where the amount of change and stimulation is low is incredibly important. So one of the things that I just had to embrace was I like working at home in an environment I have complete control over, and it doesn't involve a lot of other people because other people, as it turns out, stimulate me. And so it was always incredibly hard for me to work in an office, and I hated it. So if like each person is going to have a different manifestation of this, but like having control of your environment, incredibly important. I mean, the other big one that we've already talked about is like spend the majority of your time doing something that you actually are interested in. Like that frees up everything. I mean, like that, not optional, required. So I would say that's the other thing that I really want to emphasize. Like if you feel like you're constantly on the edge of burnout, that you're like white knuckling it, you need to be doing something that actually really interests you and where you have autonomy. So this is why a lot of people who have ADHD end up having their own business, practice, organization, because the world isn't built for us. So we have a lot of, societal structures around, like, say, the 9 to 5, the 40-hour work week. You work during these hours, you don't work during these hours, that really aren't good for ADHD brains. They just aren't. So until we have like a wider acceptance of the things that make it easier for someone to thrive with ADHD, a lot of times you're going to need to be your own boss. So I think that was something that, I spent many years fighting, and now that I've embraced it, it's pretty awesome. And I think the movement is also, for me, one of the really big ones. One of the, what I call like a keystone habit, it's something I borrow. I have an ecology background, so I borrow from it, is walking. Just for me, like, if I'm not regularly going outside and going for walks, that means something is wrong. That means something is off. Um, so paying attention to how much I'm moving and how much I'm actually like getting into my body really, really is important. And the more I do that, the more grounded I feel. So movement, I think, was another big one. Nutrition certainly matters. I'm trying to think. We talked about externalization. I think control over your schedule is another really, really good one. One of the things that I teach a lot about, I'm actually teaching a workshop later today, though I imagine people won't see it. It's a different day, but is about, you know, setting up a schedule and time management that works for your brain, which in some cases is like very little schedule management. So like entirely divorcing yourself from stereotypical ideas of like when you work, how much you work, that kind of stuff, and recognizing your natural patterns, that is really important too. Like the way I work probably looks very different and very subversive to people. Yeah.
Well, I think what I'm hearing the most, and we're going to close soon, what I'm hearing the most from all this that is so nice to hear it again is just you're really asking people to kind of tune into their nature, not what they're supposed to be, not who they've been told they're supposed to be or what they even think they should be, but what their nature is telling them. How does their body do this? How does their body live best? Not even work. Like work is one aspect, and how you were saying it bleeds into everything, relationships, how you enjoy the space in your home, the clothing you put on. Like, how does it work for you versus how is this supposed to work? Because a lot of people listening are going to think, well, I don't have the privilege of quitting my job. And I didn't either for like a long time,
Me
as you
too.
didn't either. Yeah. So I remember learning how to navigate this life with an ADHD body and brain while having a 9 to 5. I had to really build capacity before and after. I had to do little breaks during. When you say control of your space, just like my little, I never had a desk, but I had a little, like, I worked in many apothecaries, you know, so people would come in asking for herbal advice. So I'd always have a little corner that had like my own little crystal or photo, something that felt like I could attune to. And just simple things like that really held me through.
Yeah.
But if I didn't do those things, I would have been a wreck because I had been that way before. So I just think it's nice for people to hear wherever they are right now, they can incorporate these things that you're saying.
Yeah, and if you have ADHD, you're probably going to want to do all the things at once because of course you are. So you might hear me being like, you know, have complete control of your schedule, be an entrepreneur, but like it took me a long time to get here, and it was
Yes.
in fact a bunch of incremental steps. Incremental learnings about what my natural patterns are, incremental learnings about what interests me. So don't think that all because you are in this space that, you know, feels very constraining right now, that you can't build more and more sort of freedom and autonomy into what you're doing, and like start small and start experimenting. One of the things that I really encourage people to do is like look at themselves with the curiosity of like a scientist. Like you're studying yourself,
Yes.
see what tweaks you make and how it affects how you feel. Run experiments, but do it without judgment. Scientists, you know, ideally are not looking at their experiments with judgment. They're just seeing like, oh, that's what happens. So what you're doing is constantly running these tiny experiments to get more and more of this autonomy and interest-based, you know, stuff in your life. You know, you probably aren't, if you try to do it all at once. In fact, I will guarantee you'll get overwhelmed. So, you know, don't literally like flip the table on your life, though I have done that before and you can make it work. Um, just think about like, what are the things that you can do today to make tomorrow just a little bit better? And then they start adding up, and then you start really figuring out, oh, this is what I want to do. This is what I need.
I love that. You know, as we close, why don't you tell people website where they can find you?
Sure. So my website's megankierstead.com. You can look for the spelling. It involves a lot of vowels. I probably best place to find me nowadays is Instagram. I'm Meg Kierstead. And I'm actually also opening a group in March. I think it's like March 23rd, called the Black Sheep Playground, which is for us to explore all of this stuff. I essentially teach a lot of the skills that we're talking about today. Really getting in tune with your nervous system, understanding what's going on, and then like gradually making all these experimental changes to your life to like really have the life that feels easy and fun. So I'm really excited about that. I'm doing some wacky stuff with it too. We'll be having like rotating themes because I'm trying to normalize, novelty and like following the threads of your curiosity. So I'm really excited about that. Yeah, that's where you can find me.
Beautiful. It was so nice talking to you. I appreciate your time, and I'll be putting all your info in the podcast description so they can just click there.
Awesome. This was fun. Really good way to start my day.
Awesome. Okay, take care, my friend.
Bye.